How does an African slave become one of the most powerful men in India? Let's find out. Malik Ambar was born in 1548 in modern-day Ethiopia, and he was given the birth name Chapu. It's thought that he belonged to the Oromo people. Now, being relatively new to the country, the Oromos were subject to a lot of turmoil. It's said that they were a spiritual people, and because of this, they were targeted by both Christians and Muslims to be sold into slavery. Around 12,000 people a year were taken from Ethiopia and moved outwards towards North Africa and the Middle East. There are some conflicting reports of how Chapu became a slave. Some say he was captured, and others say his parents actually sold him into slavery out of sheer desperation. But either way, at the age of 12, Chapu was taken to Yemen to be auctioned off at a market. From here, he was taken to Baghdad by a merchant called Mir Qasim al-Baghdadi, who would eventually convert him to Islam. This is where Chapu would be given the Arabic name Ambar. Obviously, depending on what you need from your slaves, a bit of education could come in handy, and Mir Qasim had no intention of committing Ambar to hard labour. Instead, Qasim taught him how to read and write in Arabic, essentially allowing him to keep everything ticking over on the business side of things, almost like a managerial role. By 1571, Ambar had spent around 10 years in Baghdad with Mir Qasim, but the merchant now had bigger ideas to conduct business further afield. He took Ambar to a region in India called the Deccan Plateau. Now, this region was yet another highly volatile environment for Ambar. Divided into a number of sultanates, different religious groups held different positions in society, and it was largely ruled by a Muslim elite. Ambar was destined for the northernmost of these sultanates, Ahmadnagar. And as with the entire Deccan region, it was fraught with war, be it military coups against their own sultans or sultans trying to gain power over each other, and this would prove crucial in Ambar's quest to rule. Conflict between the sultanates wasn't the most pressing issue for the people of the Deccan. The Turkish Mughal Empire was also posing a serious threat from the north, with their main target seeming to be Ahmadnagar. Having already seized much of northern India, it would seem that the only way for the Deccan Plateau to withstand against the advancing Mughal Empire would be to develop some kind of unified spirit. Whilst the country of India was in apparent turmoil, Ambar was eventually purchased by Genghis Khan, not that one. He was in fact the equivalent of a prime minister, and unlike most of the slave owners in India at the time, he was, just like Ambar, a Habshi. Now, a Habshi was basically a slave or a freed slave. During this period, there was a strong slave trade between Africa and India, with Africans often being exchanged for goods, and the slaves which went in the other direction would be known as Habshis. So, having also been a slave, Genghis Khan was able to buy his own freedom and was now in a position of relative power, commanding an army for the Nizam Shah ruler. Now, this is a name that you'll want to remember because it will be very important later on in Ambar's story. But the idea of a slave being freed and holding significant roles in society was actually fairly common. As I said, the Deccan region had a large mix of cultures and nationalities, and those who had served as slaves, once free, were not really restricted in terms of their social mobility. They actually became a crucial part of the Deccan's culture and would play a significant role in the region's politics. But anyway, back to Ambar's story. The relationship between Ambar and Genghis Khan would apparently flourish. Ambar was almost being treated as a son. Now undergoing military training under Genghis, Ambar's abilities quickly stood out above all other Habshi soldiers. His master was impressed by Ambar's developing strength, and his formal education in Arabic would also have been an advantage for him, as this was the common language of the Ahmadnagar Sultanate. For the next 3 years, Ambar would be Genghis Khan's understudy, with the idea that he would eventually become the commander of his men. However, after this short time, Ambar would be forced to process the execution of his mentor. Supposedly, the politics of the volatile Deccan region saw him framed for some sort of collusion against Ahmadnagar, basically treason. Now, this wouldn't be the only time that Ambar would have to deal with a situation like this in his lifetime, and we'll come on to that a little bit later on. With the death of his master, Ambar was now free, but trust me, over the course of his life, the skills he developed as a slave and a soldier would define him. He initially travelled south to the Bijapur Sultanate, where he enlisted in their army. He would ultimately rise up the ranks so as to command his own group of around 1,500 soldiers who were solely loyal to him, almost following directly in Genghis Khan's footsteps. Now, this is where he was given the title Malik, or Lord, by the Sultana Bibi. So this was for his loyalty, as well as being strong in battle and being so traditionally well educated and intelligent. At this stage, it's really important to understand what the Mughal Empire was up to now. For a while, they had turned their attentions eastward, quelling rebellions and re-establishing their power. But now they'd turned their attention back to the Deccan region, advancing on Ahmadnagar. Again, the volatility of Ahmadnagar made it an easy target. And although the politics is a little bit complicated, basically Bibi laid claim to the throne in Ahmednagar through her bloodline. So she and Ambar set out to defend the Sultanate. The Mughals would slowly but surely seize most of the land of Ahmednagar, which basically led to a civil war, which was initiated by Ahmednagar's nobility. And when Bibi negotiated a peace treaty with the Mughals, this was looked at with suspicion from her allies. You see, there was no such thing as trust in the Deccan, and loyalty was a rarity. Bibi's soldiers believed that she had been colluding with the Mughal Empire, and in 1599 the Sultana would end up being slain by those very soldiers, in another example of the political volatility. Ahmednagar's vacuum of power ultimately resulted in another invasion the following year, with which the Mughals succeeded. Okay, so it's been quite dense so far and there's been a lot to take in. So what I think I'll do is I'll leave it here for now, and I'll conclude Ambar's story in part 2, which you can see right here. And be sure to like this video and subscribe if you're finding the channel interesting, and I'll see you in part 2.